Hi, welcome to session one of the sixth topic of the semester, the American Revolution from 1776 to 1783. All right, so we're starting the first session of this topic. This is the end of the colonial period. This is the last topic we're going to cover regarding the colonial period, dealing with the independence movement itself, the process by which the 13 colonies are going to get together and declare independence from the mother country, declare independence from Great Britain. Okay? And there's going to be a struggle, of course. There's going to be a revolutionary struggle against the British from 1776 to 1783 that culminated with the colonies gaining independence in 1783. They gained the recognition of Great Britain. Again, something that we're going to see more closely in this topic that will be covered also in 3 sessions, the same as we have been doing this again with the other sessions as well. So let us now turn to our outlines here so we can begin our discussion on the American Revolution. I remind you, this is a whole new topic. It's the 6th topic of the semester that is going to deal with the American Revolution. All right, so the table of contents is very important. Again, this is something I've been showing you at the very, very outset of each topic, is the organization of the topic, the main segments, the main components that we're going to examine very closely. And so this topic is going to comprise 3 main parts. The first part is going to look at the background, the origins and causes of the American Revolution. So we have to go back in time, not just a few years or even a few decades, but rather, again, going as far back as to look at the early origins of the problems, that the colonies were experiencing from Great Britain due to British policies, etc. Even going back as far as the 1600s. So, despite the fact that the independence was declared in 1776, of course, there has been a build-up, if you will, of issues that by the 1760s they were now reaching, a peak. They were reaching, of course, critical mass, if you will, to the point that by 1776, the colonists, after having, of course, trying to negotiate with the British Parliament for more representation, etc., trying to negotiate again with the British to change their policies with the colonies, because there was no negotiation. Again, the colonies issued this document, the Declaration of Independence, in 1776. But the factors that led to this point go back, again, at least a century. Again, it's a build-up of issues. This is something that we're going to examine very closely in the very first session. Particularly this particular session, we're going to devote most of our time looking at origins and causes, and we're going to be paying attention to economic factors. Okay, there were economic policies that Great Britain issued ever since the 1600s, very early on, that affected certain interests in the colonies, certain groups that will continue again to affect those groups into the 1700s, when Great Britain is going to issue far more, again, policies to regulate trade, taxes, and so on and so forth. We're going to examine closely that. But also, besides the economic factors, we're also going to examine ideological factors as well. Those are the ideas of the revolution, that is to say. So in this first part, we're also going to pay attention to the role of new political ideas that were written, particularly by Europeans. In some cases, again, those were ideas that were even written by English philosophers, English writers, English thinkers that propose new ways of governance. They propose reforms to create the ideal state, the ideal political state, that will provide more rights, more representation to the population. So we're going to see how those ideas influence also the leaders of the colonies, in terms of them changing their minds as to what was actually possible, by freeing themselves from Great Britain, attaining independence, and creating, of course, a new ideal political state. So it's also important to look at ideology, the political ideas that also influence the decision for independence as well. It will be examined here very closely. So the second, of course, segment is going to look at the coming and process of the American Independence Revolution. We're not really going to cover, military campaigns, etc., but just the immediate events leading to the Declaration of Independence, starting in 1763. We're going to see, of course, the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain, changing, becoming more and more aggravated. And finally, again, there's going to be the Declaration of Independence and, of course, the struggle for independence itself, that is the war, of course, that ended in 1783. Again, we're going to see that. And the last part will be quite, a short overview of the outcome, what the actual outcome of the American Revolution was. Again, the series of changes, etc., again, that the revolution brought. So this is, again, in very general terms, what we're going to cover in this topic in 3 sessions. But in this particular session, we're going to initiate with part 1, the origins and causes of the American Revolution. And we are going to begin with the economic origins of the American Revolution. Once again, we're starting with the economic factors. And then we're going to move into the ideological factors after we examine the economic factors. So the economic origins of the American Revolution go back to a series of laws, reforms that the British Parliament implemented to regulate trade with the British colonies. Again, the British were beginning to establish a series of colonies in the American continent. Of course, in North America, but also in the Caribbean islands. There will be a series of colonies there, like Jamaica, Barbados, for example. And as we'll see, even the subcontinent of India will be colonized as well. So by the 1600s, the British are beginning to expand, their control, if you will, of some regions, for example, in the Americas and also in Asia, like in India, and establish some colonial territories there. And the purpose, of course, was for those colonies to produce certain resources, particularly agricultural products, that are going to, at least that was the idea, that those agricultural products will be shipped directly to the mother country, Great Britain, and from Great Britain, the British will distribute those products, will sell them inside of England, in Europe, and also overseas, again, in the world market. So that's the idea. The purpose, again, of colonies was to serve the mother country economically. They were to produce products, particularly agricultural products, for the most part. Agricultural products is not exclusively agricultural products, because the British are also extracting furs, for example, in the fur trade in North America as well, skins, deer skin, and so on and so forth. Again, lumber and the like. So yes, there's a wide variety of different products they extract from colonies, but the ones that are considered the most valuable that around the world, that there's a market around the world for those products, are products that are grown in their plantations, in their colonies, again, such as particularly sugar and tobacco, starting with those crops in the 1600s and 1700s. So at some point, the British as well as the other European empires that also established colonies in the Americas, like the Portuguese, like the Spanish, for example, as well, the French, the Dutch. In their own way, each European empire is trying to regulate the trade with their own colonies. You know, they just want to make sure that the products that the colonies create are shipped directly to the mother country, because it was just so easy for the planters, again, in those colonies, or the sugar planters, tobacco planters, etc., for those merchants, for those landowners to sell the products to the competition, whether it was to the French companies or the Dutch companies, etc. It was so easy to do so because trade was not regulated in the very beginning of this process of colonization. There was not 100% supervision, if you will, that the colonies must have to ship all their products on British ships that will be sent to London. So this is something that is going to come about much, much later, once the colonies are producing products and they're generating resources, they're generating products, and they're generating crops. And so the British Parliament is now moving forward with introducing laws to regulate particularly that trade. And those laws were labeled as the Navigation Acts. Okay, the Navigation Acts, those are the laws of trade. Again, trade regulation and also trade taxation as well. So what those laws were simply concerned with, again, is simply regulating the flow of goods from the colonies to the mother country, to make sure that this trade was totally, regulated in terms of the colonies exporting those products directly to Great Britain. And in case the competition, the French, the Dutch, wanted to buy products, they needed to buy those products from the British back in Europe and pay, of course, the prices imposed by the British, and also pay taxes as well. Okay, and if the colonies needed to import goods as well, they needed to also pay taxes on imported goods as well. So the commercial relationships, again, had to be supervised, and they have to be enforced, that the colonies were the possession of the mother country, and they needed to pretty much bring those colonies closer and closer together commercially with the mother countries. Again, they're called the Navigation Acts because all trade was taking place in ocean-going trade. Navigation traffic, if you will, had to be monitored. The ports will have to be supervised, and shipping as well supervised, etc. It's called Navigation Acts, of course. So one of the reasons why very early on, back in the 1600s, Great Britain is also interested, is very much concerned with introducing those navigation acts, was precisely because, as we explained in the last topic we covered, again, colonial society in flux, when we were talking about the French and Indian War, particularly when we were talking about the French and Indian War, is that the British, the Dutch, and the French are now engaged by the 1650s onwards in a series of trade wars. Okay, we covered that. I'm not going to repeat everything I said in that topic, but again, if you go back to that topic, I explained that, again, now there's a battle for the North American trade. Okay, those three European powers are disputing the control of North America, particularly when it comes to trade. Who's going to be the dominant empire of North America, and who's going to control the trade, again, of North America, whether it's the fur trade and all the products that North America produces. Again, so they engage in a series of conflicts. We examined that, of course. So this is another reason why Great Britain is also very concerned about regulating, monitoring, supervising trade with the colonies, because the Dutch and the French are the competition. They're at war, and they are all battling over the flow of goods. The trade routes, for example, they're contested as well, and so they just want to make sure that that their own colonies are not trading with the competition. They want to make sure that if the colonies are growing things like tobacco and sugar, that they're not actually selling those products to French or Dutch companies. That was so easy to do, by the way, during this time, because, again, trade was not regulated. So they want to exert now a monopoly on this trade. The British want a trade monopoly with the colonies to exclude non-British merchants. In other words, that's the idea of the Navigation Acts, is we have to monopolize the trade with the colonies and exclude in the process, by enforcing those Navigation Acts, we're going to actually exclude the Dutch and the French merchants from actually accessing our resources, because those are British, of course, companies. Remember, we covered that again in the past, that the British, the way they established their colonies was by issuing charters, again, to private merchants that were creating joint stock companies. Again, those were actually trading companies that were to establish themselves in North America on behalf of the mother country, on behalf of the monarch, in order to operate on behalf of the mother country, to produce items that the mother country was going to receive for the purpose of exporting them around the world. And of course, the company and the shareholders, they're all, of course, going to share the benefits, the dividends, the profits, again, of those operations. So those were actually private companies, again, the colonies, that could very easily just engage in their own private arrangements with the competition, okay, and trade with the competition as well. So that's exactly what the British Parliament is trying to avoid. They're trying to avoid, a leak, if you will, in the system. That they don't want to be losing resources. They don't want their own colonies or companies, trading companies, to also be sharing the wealth with the competition, because, again, in Europe, the British, the Dutch, and the French are at the war, of course. There's a war over trade. So the Navigation Acts were precisely to enforce this flow of goods. The trade itself needed to be regulated, needed to be monitored, and as early as 1651, okay, the British Parliament is beginning to issue in the first Navigation Acts that were to enforce trade regulation with the colonies in the American continent. And it's not just the North American British colonies, but also the British were already moving into the Caribbean. They were establishing colonies in the Caribbean islands of Barbados and Jamaica. Those were sugar producing islands as well. And of course, they want to make sure that the tobacco and the sugar produced in those colonies are going to be shipped directly to the mother country. So as early as 1651 and much, much later, in 1673, the British Parliament issued the very first Navigation Acts that were intending to only regulate two particular products that were produced in their colonies. Again, it's not that the British are not interested in regulating all of the trade. It's not the case. It's just that the most important crops, the most important cash crops, the most valuable, actually, by the way, again, for the British economy, that 76% of all the British imports, again, the 76% of all the products that were produced in British colonies that were coming into England, 76% alone were tobacco and sugar, again, products. Again, so those were the bulk, again, of the goods that the British produced overseas, that in a very real sense, tobacco and sugar were sustaining the British economy at this point. The British economy itself was sustained with the sugar and tobacco trade. So they want to make sure, therefore, that tobacco and sugar is going to be shipped directly to the mother country. How they're going to do that? Well, those navigation acts of 1651 and 1673, what they stated is that tobacco and sugar, this is what the navigation acts, again, stipulated. Those were the first navigation acts, again, of the British Empire concerning the American colonies, is that tobacco and sugar had to be shipped to the mother country, but it has to be shipped in special ships, in special vessels, in special cargo ships, again, that the British are going to craft. So the British are beginning to craft very special types of cargo ships, English vessels that carry certain permits, licenses in them that were very recognizable even from afar, that those were indeed the official legal English cargo ships that the British were using now to board cargo from one port, let's say in a colony, let's say Virginia or Jamaica, for example, and actually take it back to London. Again, those were very special types of merchant vessels, okay, cargo ships. And so the British ended up creating, of course, with those navigation acts, a fleet system. The British fleet system is a large fleet, again, that was actually used to those were the official, again, vessels that were to transfer goods back and forth from the colonies to the mother country and vice versa, again. And so they had to be boarded on those ships. Otherwise, it would be considered illegal cargo. If a planter, again, let's say in Virginia or Barbados, Jamaica, etc., is selling tobacco, let's say, to a merchant and boarding that cargo in a ship that it was not the official vessel, that the vessel could be indeed confiscated. Again, under the Navigation Act, that was what's to happen. Even though in the very initial years, when the Navigation Acts were introduced, that trade was not 100% enforced. It was on paper, the law was there, this is what the colonies were supposed to do, but it's not, the British are not going to spend enormous resources at this time in trying to make sure that everything is boarded on those ships, or else, I mean, that was the expectation that they had to do so, of course. The Navigation Acts of 1651 and 73 also indicated that tobacco and sugar that will be sold to the French and the Dutch companies, if they want to purchase sugar and tobacco, they must purchase that in London. In other words, not in the colonies. They will have to go to London and actually buy it at the prices dictated by Great Britain and pay also export duties. They needed to pay their export fees, in other words, as well. So that's where the Navigation Acts stipulated. Also, in order to monitor and supervise, the Navigation Acts, that they were to be obeyed, the Navigation Acts also allow for the creation of the very first custom houses. Okay, custom houses are going to be now built in the major ports of the British colonies, and of course, there's going to be now custom officials arriving to the colonies precisely. They're arriving, of course, from England. They get their appointment back in England to go to the Americas, and their role, their function is make sure that the people are obeying the Navigation Acts and boarding the cargo on that special fleet system, etc. Again, and like I said, even though there are custom officials, etc., this is not to say that 100% all the time the colonies were simply obeying, again, the Navigation Acts, because there's going to be a lot of smuggling taking place. People found ways to trade with the competition. Back in the colonies, people will often imported goods from French companies, Dutch companies, or exported products by selling them again to the French and the Dutch, by circumventing again those custom houses, and making sure that they will actually sell the products to the competition through some other means, again through some other entry point, etc. So again, there's going to be, of course, all of that taking place. The colonies, as we'll see, became kind of accustomed to a free trade system, even though they were not supposed to trade freely, because the Navigation Acts, indicated otherwise. They couldn't trade freely with whomever they wanted. But nonetheless, the situation is that the colonies were in a kind of relaxed position, in that the Navigation Acts are not 100% enforced at this point. So, in one of the reasons, again, that the British are not necessarily doing everything they can to make sure that their American colonies obey those Navigation Acts, is because in the 1600s, particularly when we talk about that century, this is a very special, very important century for Great Britain, because this is when Great Britain is now on the rise of becoming a commercial empire. By the way, is began to establish colonies not only in America but also in India. Okay, so it is, the British are so busy, in Asia. They're, of course, created a company, a trading company, at the very onset of the 1600s, called the East India Company. Again, this is an international trading company that the British created in 1600 for the purpose of bringing spices from the Far East. Particularly, we're talking from India, from the subcontinent of India. This is the major producer of spices. And so the British are also, besides establishing colonies in America, they're also concerned with the spice trade. Okay? And the East India Company is moving into the Indian subcontinent, and very gradually, slowly but surely, is becoming very successful in establishing trading relationships, again, with the Indian merchants, the Indian plantation owners that are in charge of producing the spices. And the East India Company is buying in bulk, wholesale, entire fields, again, of products, and they're going to be like a preferred customer, so to speak, by many Indian princes. There's a lot of Indian kings or princes. They have their own kingdoms, etc., and they're dealing with the East India Company. And slowly but surely, across the century, what is going to happen is that the East India Company, okay, is going to begin purchasing land. Okay, in many cases, it begins to purchase land in India. Okay, it serves as a lender as well to Indian princes, Indian kings, that over time, many of them were unable to pay those loans back, so they were, in many cases, turning over part of their lands in their kingdoms to the East India Company. So through those kinds of arrangements, land purchases, land treaties, etc., commercial arrangements, the East India Company is going to be responsible for pretty much colonizing a great portion of the Indian subcontinent. And through the East India Company, India becomes part of Great Britain. It becomes a colony. It becomes a British colony. India. Okay, and so this was the ultimate, achievement, the crown jewel, if you will, of Asian trade that most Europeans were so fascinated about, so adamant about in controlling, trying to control it, was India itself. Now India, the major producers of spices, are now part of the British Empire, of the British commercial empire. And what that entails is that the British are now in control of the spice trade. Okay, by 1687, they're in again. India has become a colony of Great Britain, so therefore, all of the spices, again, all of the products that that India generates year by year is now going to flow towards Great Britain. Okay, so this is very important because this is exactly what the Europeans were after ever since Marco Polo returned from this journey to the Far East. If you remember, in the second topic, we talked about, again, Marco Polo, his expedition to the Far East in the 1200s, when he came back in 1296 with spices, pretty much set off a commercial revolution in Europe and in the world, and the rise of international trade. And from that point onwards, the Europeans have been trying to reach the Indian spices. Again, this is the dream of the Portuguese, the dream of the Spaniards, the dream of the Dutch, to pretty much take control of the spice trade. And now this has become a reality for the British. They're the ones that have now control and monopolize the spice trade by colonizing India. And so this is one of the reasons why the British are not going to be so concerned, if you will, with regulating trade in the American continent, because they're simply so busy in Asia. They're fascinated that they are establishing colonial control in India, and they find India to be far more important for the British Empire than the American colonies. So this is not to say that the American colonies are not important, but they are so, again, concerned about trying to gain a firm grip of the Asian market, of this Asian trade, the spice trade particularly, in making sure that the flow of goods from India, that they're going to be coming directly to Great Britain, again, to the British. So in 1696, British Parliament introduced a new Navigation Act. This Navigation Act, by the way, is going to simply concentrate on India. The Navigation Act of 1696 was intended to regulate the Indian trade, okay, making sure that India is only going to trade with the mother country, Great Britain, to exclude other competitors, particularly the European rivals like the Dutch and the French, for example. The British are convinced that they must be excluded, of course, from the spice trade, from India's trade. Okay, so this is a very important development because this explains, at least partially, why the American colonies are pretty much trading on their own. They're being left alone, quote unquote. Again, they were not supposed to be trading with the competition, but they are. And Great Britain knows about this, but they're letting it happen just because they're more concerned, again, with India at this time. They're beginning to take the very first steps to regulate sugar and tobacco. We talked about that. The first Navigation Acts regulate sugar and tobacco in the American colonies, of course. But right now, their attention is totally in Asia, okay, in India. Okay, so this is exactly, once again, this is India, okay, and the British, okay, are now, the East India Company, again, is now journeying every year to India and loading the spices and other products and bringing those products, whether spices and teas, etc., returning to Europe with those products, commercializing those products, not only in Europe, but also they introduce those products they bring from India in their American colonies in North America, but also in the Caribbean islands as well. Again, so the East India Company is going to be carrying those goods back and forth, particularly goods from India to Europe and America. Again, and particularly, there's going to be one particular commodity that is going to gain a lot of significance, a lot of value, a lot of popularity within Europe, and most importantly in Great Britain, of course, but also in North America. And this is a product that the East India Company is bringing from India. This is a product that the Indian peoples have grown and consumed for many, many centuries, so thousands of years. Okay, so what this crop is of course tea. Okay, black tea, that is to say. Okay, so this is part of Indian culture. The peoples of India for thousands of years have domesticated. Okay, this tree comes actually, this is the leaf of a specific tree that people grow in plantations, by the way, and they're let to dry for prolonged periods of time. It turns black because it's oxidized. People brew it. It's high in caffeine, by the way, and people in India pretty much drink black tea all day long, not just in the morning, okay, to have a jolt of energy because it has high caffeine content, but also, again, this provides, of course, energy. It provides a lot of pleasure because it's very tasty. People add spices as well. People put sugar in it, milk, again. And in India, people drink tea all day long. Again, all day long. Not only in the morning, but all across the day. This is part of their culture. It's, again, for thousands of years, this has been part of, again, the Indian tradition. And the East India Company, of course, is going to now favor this crop because even though it was known, teas, the Asian teas, whether they were Indian teas or Chinese teas, they were well known, of course, in Europe. But this is something that only the ruling class, again, had access to because it was very, very pricey. Okay, it was very pricey that not a lot of people could afford being drinking tea. This is something that only the nobility, for example, had access to. It was very, very expensive. But now, the East India Company that is introducing this crop, this commodity in Europe in bulk, in great, great numbers, then the price of tea is going to drop significantly. So instead of being a commodity that only a handful of people, those with the means, the rich people or the nobility had access to, will become now affordable to all the population. Again, from peasants to artisans to the middle class that is on the rise, by the way, very, very, steady. It's on the rise in England, for example, as well. Those are the merchants, for example. The merchant class is also going to have, great access to this crop. So not just the nobility, but literally all the groups, all the social groups, again, of English society will find it more and more accessible just because there's so much tea being imported now by the East India Company that everybody's becoming very, very much fond of drinking tea. And a tea culture is on the rise, okay? Not only in England, because, as I explained, the East India Company is also introducing tea to North America, okay? The East India Company also brings tea to the British colonies, particularly to places like New York, Massachusetts, for example, Pennsylvania. South Carolina. Again, so there's going to be also a tea culture on the rise in the British colonies as well. Okay, not just in England, not only in Great Britain. And so this tea culture could be seen in Great Britain with the growing presence of tea shops and tea houses. They're propping up again across the English towns in London and all across England. It was very visible. It's like, for example, today when you see coffee shops, almost in every corner. Again, something like that. Yeah, coffee, of course, is the preferred, drink in the United States today. But back then there was no coffee. People knew about coffee, but again, we're not going to see, massive quantities of coffee introduced in England. It was actually tea. People drank the tea because of the energy, because it was pleasurable and the like. People actually mix it with spices. They put sugar in it, a drop, splash of milk. It was highly pleasurable, like an energy drink, so to speak. Once again, this is a tea culture is on the rise because now, there's a lot of stores. There's a lot of tea shops, and you can have a menu, a wide variety of different Indian teas, for example, coming from different regions of India. And there's the tea houses. People go there, like a coffee shop, for example, a coffee place. Very similar. Again, people go there, they drink the tea, they socialize, etc. And because we see the rise of Protestantism, Protestant groups also in England that are turning away from alcohol consumption, what we see is that the alternative to alcohol was tea. That you can actually gather with people, party, have a tea party, in other words, okay? And people, of course, drink a lot of caffeine, and they're, highly energized, and they're having a good time, and they're high on caffeine, by the way, instead of being drunk on alcohol. So we see a tea culture on the rise that was visible, very, very visible, again, in Great Britain, but we're also going to see that in North America, particularly in New England. In New England, there's also going to be a tea culture on the rise. This is the stronghold of the Puritans, and likewise, the Puritans use, tea for partying. There's a tea party, for example, okay, as well. And so what that means is that as there's a growing demand for tea in Europe and in America, we're going to see that Indian teas, those black teas, are going to become highly prized, very valued commodity in the European markets, in America, and around the world at large. That this is going to be now a new cash crop that is going to gain a lot of significance again in the world market. Just like spices had its moment in the past. We saw the rise of the spice trades, for example, the rise of sugar, as a prime cash crop as well, that pretty much dominated also the world demand for the production of sugar. There was, this first mass consumer product. We talked about sugar in the past, tobacco as well. Well, tea is now also joining again those preferred commodities that are circulating around the world, and that people are willing to pay money for that, of course. And to a certain extent, the British feel that they have the monopoly of the tea trade because they're the ones that colonized India. So they feel that in order to exert a more firm grip in the tea trade, they had to then regulate trade with India. So therefore, they introduced what is called the Navigation Act of 1696. Okay, the Navigation Act of 1696 was an act of Parliament that established that trade had to be monitored quite closely with the Indian subcontinent, because this is now part of Great Britain. has become a British colony now. And in order to do so, what the British are intending to do, this is what the Navigation Act of 1696 says, is that we have to do this, supervision, this trade regulation, far more effectively and efficiently. Okay, we cannot just allow India to trade with multiple merchants from different regions of the world. We need to make sure that they're only trading with the East India Company. Okay, that the East India Company is going to have a total monopoly of the Indian trade. So we have to do it that again, trade regulation far more effectively, far more efficiently. So what they're going to do is try to reform the system of trade regulation. Okay, trying to modernize it. Okay, we have to modernize. We have to upgrade our system of administration, how we actually go about regulating trade. Okay. So there's going to be significant change in the way the British are beginning to manage their colonies, and of course their total focus now is India. Okay, they're not necessarily not yet concerned with the American colonies, even though they're going to be soon enough. But it is in 1696 that they're upgrading their system of administration by introducing, of course, certain changes, okay, that are going to now serve the British to monitor more closely, supervise more closely, and enforce their laws of trade. They want a more efficient administration. So what that entailed, a more efficient administration, is that we need to now, instead of sending people, custom officials to India to establish a series of, custom, houses there, to send anybody there, instead of just sending anybody that will do that job, we need to send people that are trained, again, that are prepared to do this task, people that have certain training. They have degrees, if you will, in international trade, etc. So they're beginning to select people for this job on the basis of merit. In other words, not just because we're friends and you give me this post, I'm going to actually have a job again overseas. That they want, again, this administrative task to be done by experts, by people that have the skills, the training to do that, okay? And that they're going to take their job very seriously, and they're going to actually enforce the laws of trade, okay? So this is an upgrade, if you will, in the system of administration. They're modernizing it, in other words. And of course, their whole aim is to drive out the Dutch and the French, from the Indian trade, by, of course, making this system more and more efficient. What they're intending to do is that we need to prevent the Dutch and French companies from actually obtaining any spices from India, okay? Because we need to exert a total monopoly of the Indian trade, and we're going to give that monopoly to our most important company. Again, in this case, East India Company is going to be the only company that was allowed to trade with India. Okay, only that company. So that company has that special fleet. We were talking about, those special cargo ships. They're the licensed ships. They're only legitimate cargo ships from which the Indian products, particularly tea and spices as well, must be carried back to London. Okay, so once again, this is the Navigation Act of 1696. Is really a law that was trying to bring India as close as possible to the mother country. So this is only applying to India. Okay, the Navigation Act of 1696, this is pretty much all focused on India. So of course, what the Navigation Act of 1696 is going to do is build, of course, a series of custom houses in India, across all the Indian ports. The major international ports of India are now going to be controlled by the British, and they're going to station there custom officials and tax collectors, by the way, who are very well trained, again, to do that. Again, so also what the Navigation Act of 1696 did was to patrol, if you will, okay, the Indian Ocean to prevent smuggling, from taking place. So they're going to actually create what is called a merchant navy. They create a merchant navy. They're going to send it to the Indian Ocean, and what the merchant navy is going to do is there's several tasks, several functions of the merchant navy. One is to escort the ships of the East India Company en route to India, because there's a lot of piracy taking place. Of course, there's pirates. They can steal your ship, they can steal your cargo, etc. So there's a lot of pirates on the high seas, and the merchant navy is there to protect merchants, English merchants. But also, what the merchant navy it was supposed to do under the Navigation Act of 1696 was to also patrol the Indian Ocean to prevent that merchants coming from different places, such as Asia, from China, for example, from the Middle East, or from Europe, that were not legitimate. They had no legitimate permit or license to trade with India. That those ships had to be stopped on the high seas and prevent them from reaching the Indian ports, or to stop them on the high seas if they're sailing out of an Indian port, in order to search for them, to ask what they're doing in the region, for example, if they're carrying illegal cargo, if they're smuggling, in other words, of course. So they're actually going to be enforcing the Navigation Act. They want to make sure that there's no other merchant trading with India other than the East India Company. And of course, those merchant navy ships are going to search the boats on the high seas, and in case they found that they carried illegal cargo, let's say spices that they obtained from India, they didn't pay any export duties. They were not supposed to be carrying that cargo because they're not licensed to do that. So they're going to be tried again inside of the ship. The ship itself is going to contain a system of courts, Admiralty courts, they're called. Those are actually courts in which the owner of the ship or the captain will be tried. It will be fined in many cases, or the merchandise will be confiscated because they violated the rule of trade, the law of trade. In other words, you have violated the law of trade of, again, the Navigation Act, for example, 1696. You're smuggling, okay? Because you're smuggling, therefore, you have no rights to the cargo itself. We're going to seize it, etc. There were fines and so on and so forth. Again, so the British are beginning now, to really enforce, to really apply their laws of trade more decisively in India, more so that it was done anywhere by any other power before them. Again, the British are leading the way in terms of how commercial empires are beginning now to enforce their trade, their laws of trade with their colonies. And of course, the other European empires are going to follow suit. They're going to try to imitate what the British were doing, and also try to enforce their colonies as well. All right, so what this is going to lead up to checking the time here. Okay, so what this is going to lead to is that as the British are attempting to regulate trade and come up with laws of trade like the Navigation Act, etc., that were trying to implement a more enclosed system of trade between the mother country and the colonies. An enclosed system is that the trade taking place between the mother country and the colonies are not going to allow the participation of non-British merchants, non-British parties. They're going to be totally excluded, and those that are trying to get into the circuit again of this trade, they're going to be violating this particular law, and therefore this is going to lead up to certain charges. For example, the charge of smuggling. So we're going to see, of course, a terminology that is going to be introduced now in the laws of trade, and those are, things like smuggling and smugglers, that there will be people that are violating the rules of trade. Those are monopolies, of course, because what those empires were attempting to do was simply monopolize the trade, and anybody trying to gain any benefits from this monopoly outside of the system by not paying the proper taxes, etc., and so on, those individuals will simply be labeled as smugglers, that is to say, and there was a charge. There was a penalty, of course, to pay for violating the laws, the Navigation Acts. And again, smugglers were considered to be outlaws, if you will, by the British. And of course, all the other European empires, like France, etc., they're following suit. They're trying to also implement also their own laws to persecute smugglers as well, even though in a very real sense, they're all participating in one way or another in smuggling whenever they trade, of course, with a party outside of their own trading system. Okay, so what this is going to create, therefore, is a situation by which in the 13 colonies, in the 13 British colonies, what we're going to see, particularly as we move into the 1700s, is that we're going to see the rise of merchants, okay, in the British colonies that are going to be trading outside of the British enclosed trading system, okay? They're simply going about their daily lives by, for example, importing products from non-British companies, Dutch and French companies, products that had a demand inside of the colonies, okay? And because the Navigation Acts were not necessarily enforced in the North American British colonies, they're going to feel somewhat relaxed, at ease, at the fact that those Navigation Acts were not necessarily enforced, that they're not being persecuted for violating the rules of trade, even though they're actually violating the rules of trade, and because they're actually smuggling, of course. They're smuggling, of course, products outside of the British trading system, because they actually buy products from non-British sources, products that are in great demand in the colonies. So very often what we see is that they're buying things like tea, okay, spices, they buy sugar, they buy molasses, for example, rum as well. They buy those products. Those products are not produced in the colonies. They have to be exported. So the colonies do not produce spices, teas, rum, molasses, and sugar. They have to be imported, okay? And very often, what we see is colonial merchants buy in bulk. What they do is that they just buy in bulk, wholesale, at very cheap prices, from the French and the Dutch companies, they turn around, they import those goods in the colonies and sell those products at higher prices. And that's how they actually, of course, make a business, of course. And we're going to see very successful enterprises, very successful businesses on the rise in the colonies, particularly, again, from those particular merchants that are actually profiting, if you will, from this type of free trade system. It's not supposed to be a free trade system, but they're operating on a free trade system. Look, we're just simply buying products that are very convenient for us to buy. You know, they're affordable, they're cheap, we can buy wholesale, very low prices, and we turn around and we, sell them at higher prices in the colonies. Again, that's a very good business. In other occasions, we see that some planters, exported actually tobacco as well, outside of the system, outside of the enclosed system of trade. And again, whether those were tobacco planters in Virginia or in Maryland, for example, South Carolina, at times what they did was also to sell the tobacco to the highest bidder. Whoever will pay more for tobacco, okay, you'll buy it again, even though they're not, they're not British. So this is how the colonies were operating. Despite the fact that of course, there's rules of trade, the Navigation Acts we discussed at the very beginning of the session. Despite that fact, there's still a kind of free trade system taking place in North America. We're going to see the rise of independent colonial merchants, therefore, and they're becoming quite prominent. They're not just ordinary merchants. They're actually very successful, and they're becoming very, very dominant or predominant, better stated, again, in their own colonies. Those are the wealthy merchants, if you will. Okay. For example, in Boston, Massachusetts. Boston, Massachusetts was very well known. Again, to have a group of tea merchants, again, that were the predominant, business class, if you will, of Massachusetts. They're in Boston, the capital, and again, they have risen in predominance, particularly because of this type of free trade, particularly the tea trade. There's now a tea culture on the rise in Massachusetts, in New England, and they're actually importing, they're importing the tea, they're also importing sugar, because tea and sugar goes together. So it's not just the tea, it's also the sugar, the molasses, for example, spices, etc. Again, in New York is also very well known for the presence of very prominent, very wealthy merchants as well, that were operating on this kind of loose type of free trading system, this unsupervised type of trading system as well, in Philadelphia and South Carolina as well. Okay, we're going to see that in particularly, again, in those places, we're going to see the rise of very wealthy merchants that London is very much aware. Okay, back in London, in the city of London, in the capital, again, with the British Parliament, is very, very well aware, again, of what is taking place. And some of those merchants are very well known as well back in England. In fact, they're known as the smugglers, they're called. Okay, they were dubbed or named as the smugglers, of course. For example, in Massachusetts, one of the wealthiest individuals that had accumulated fortunes from the tea trade itself was John Hancock, for example. He's going to be the person that is going to sign the Declaration of Independence, even though it was written by a Virginia planter, Thomas Jefferson. He was a plantation owner, by the way, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. We see that the person that actually signed the Declaration of Independence was John Hancock. He was a tea merchant. Of course, he was very well known as a smuggler by the members of Parliament. So what we see is that the colonies are prospering. We see, the accumulation of wealth, if you will, by certain individuals who who were operating on this free trade system, so to speak, and the navigation acts that are going to arrive, therefore, to the colonies, particularly after the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. Most of those new laws of trade that the British are going to pass, the British Parliament is going to pass to regulate trade more closely with the British colonies of North America, they affected the interests, again, of those wealthy merchants, tea merchants particularly, but also planters in the southern colonies, again. So it is precisely this group of people that are going to bear the burden, if you will, of most of the laws of trade and the taxes that the British are going to implement, and they're going to be actually the leaders of independence. Again, they're going to be the ones leading the way for rallying the masses, rallying the people in the colonies to support the cause for independence. Okay, so we still have some time. All right, so that is exactly what is going to happen. Okay, we're going to see the British now, as we move into the 1700s, becoming more and more concerned with their colonies in America and trying to bring them as close as possible to the mother country, to enclose the system, in other words, to make sure that those colonies are not going to be trading, again, with the competition. So the question arises, why is it that in the 1700s, members of parliament are going to change their attitudes, change their minds, and begin to regulate trade with the colonies of North America when they were pretty much left alone all this time? And I explain, of course, because they were busy back in India. Of course, you know, they spent most of their energies, their attention back in India, it's true. But there's a couple of factors that intervene in changing the mindset, changing the minds of the attitudes of members of parliament in terms of ending, the free trade system that the colonies operated under, instead closing that free trade and trying to monopolize the trade in North America. Why? Why is that? Okay, why they're going to introduce new navigation acts to enforce the laws of trade in the North American British colonies. So the first factor is, of course, the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War itself was the first critical factor that is going to change British policy. Okay, this is the 7 Years' War. We talked about that, of course, in the previous topic. So I'm not going to actually repeat, everything I said about the French and Indian War. The only thing that stands out is that, among other things, what this war did was that it left Great Britain with a large debt, okay, defending the colonies from the French and their Indian allies, again, for 7 years. This was a 7 Years' War, by the way. That was very costly. It actually took a heavy toll on the British Treasury. And at the end, what the British are trying to do is simply pay off this debt by raising revenues. In other words, we need to raise taxes. We need to raise taxes to pay for this debt. So, therefore, they believed we must now tax the colonies. We have not taxed the colonies up to this point, but now we are. And the reason is because they also have to bear some of the burden for this war, the French and Indian War. They should bear some of the burden. So therefore, because they're also British subjects, again, they're part of the British Empire, they must pay their dues as well. So the first critical factor is actually the French and Indian War itself. Okay, that is, what is going to change, again, the British policy to start now, implementing rules of trade. The French and Indian War, the large debt. But there's also going to be another factor that intervened in convincing the members of parliament that this was the best course of action, taxing the colonies, regulating trade, etc. And the second factor deals with the East India Company itself. Okay, so the East India Company, this is the largest, again, trading company of the British Empire by far, the most important, the most profitable. This is the one that was in control of the spice trade, the tea trade, and so on. This is the company that actually accomplished the colonization of India, by the way. This company was in financial distress. It was experiencing a lot of losses, okay, due to the fact that a lot of tea that the East India Company had imported from India was simply sitting on warehouses. There are dozens and dozens of tons of tea, again, it's just sitting in British warehouses, in England itself, in Great Britain. Again, there's going to be warehouses, and there's going to be tea just stacked there, sitting there, and it was actually about to rot, if you will. It was not at the point of being totally wasted or anything. It's just that there's, in a certain sense, a saturation of the market. They're overflooding the market with so much tea that the company is not moving this product, is not selling it, because there's only so much tea that people can drink, again, back in Great Britain. There's only so much tea that people can drink in Europe, and that market was already saturated. And so the finances of the company were in trouble, and so the British Empire needed to, in a certain sense, help this company sell this tea as quickly as possible, okay? Because it was so costly to bring it. Again, it's enormous resources come in place in order to bring all this tea from India against a long stretch, etc. Again, and they're not selling it. So what the members of parliament, along with this company, are going to think is that there is a market that they have not totally took control of, and that is the North American market. In other words, the British colonies are very, very fond of drinking tea. In fact, they have been drinking tea for quite a while. They import it all the time. There's a great market there, okay? And so we're not actually taking advantage of that, because so far they have smuggled all this tea. They have purchased the tea from French and Dutch companies again. So that has to stop. In other words, we need to make sure that the North American British colonies are now going to buy the tea exclusively from the East India Company. So again, some of the navigation laws that we're going to see, they're laws that are beginning to now turn the monopoly of this trade to the East India Company. East India Company will be given a total monopoly on the trade with North America. So what that means is, so what happened to India, okay, in 1696, where the British created a very efficient system of trade regulation and trade administration, that system, again, that tied India and Great Britain very close together. It was well monitored, it was patrolled, etc., all that. That system had to now be implemented in North America, again, to benefit the East India Company, just the way that East India Company was the company that was given the trade monopoly in India. So all of the rules of trade were implemented there to make sure that India was only trading with East India Company. Likewise, the British are going to do exactly that. They're simply going to give East India Company all the entitlements, all the rights to trade in North America. So products that had to be imported in North America, that the British colonists demanded, that there was a demand for them, well, they have to be brought in by British companies. again, East India Company is going to play a key role in this. And also the tea, particularly tea, again, more so than anything else. If they're going to drink the tea, the British East India Company is the only company that can import the tea as well. Okay, they're going to be the only ones that are going to not only bring it, okay, to the colonies, but they're going to be the only ones that will be able to sell it as well. It's not just importing it, so the colonial merchants will simply buy it from the company and sell it on their own at their own prices. But no, what we're going to see is that the East India Company is going to be given a total control, a total monopoly of the tea trade in terms of not only importing it, but also selling it inside of the colonies. And of course, they're going to actually sell it at lower prices. Again, so East India Company was willing to actually just sell it very cheaply in the colonies, just so they could just sell all their tea from their warehouses. What they want to do is move this product as quickly as possible. They want to now send all this product to North America, send it very cheaply, but in this process, they're going to displace the colonial merchants. They're going to drive them out of business, in other words. Now, the colonial merchants cannot compete with this company. Now, it's because this company is going to control the trade, they're going to sell it, and they're going to sell it very cheaply. So it's not going to be that profitable anymore, to sell tea in North America. So this is going to, of course, exacerbate, if you will, okay, the relationship between the colonies and the mother country, particularly because it affected, of course, particular interests, the tea merchants, the wealthy merchants that were importing, again, products from France and Holland, and they were, of course, building their fortunes on that. But again, they're going to be displaced with the new navigation laws that are beginning to arrive to the colonies, particularly after the French and Indian War that ended in 1763. So after the end of the French and Indian War, we're going to see Parliament initiating those changes, implementing new laws of trade called the navigation laws that are going to tie those colonies closer and closer together with the mother country, driving out, of course, the colonial merchants out of business, and in the process, of course, enforcing all trade, whether it's the import, the export of products, taxing the trade as well, and beginning to implement the first taxes that colonies must pay as well. Again, something that, of course, we're going to actually examine again in the second session more closely. In the second session, we're going to examine particularly, again, the navigation laws of the 1760s, and we're going to also examine the ideas of the revolution, how the colonial merchants are going to read, the philosophies, the political ideas of European thinkers that are going to convince them that the best course of action, to solve their problems with the mother country, the taxes and the trade regulation, was to simply declare independence, because by doing so, they were to create the ideal state, the ideal political community that will provide certain rights to the citizens and representation. People will be allowed to participate, people of property, by the way, property owners, for example. But they were going to create something new, a totally new experiment, a new political community again. So we're going to examine that all in session 2 when we come back. This is all I have for you as for now. And in session 2, we're going to proceed with the origins and the causes and beyond. Okay? Thank you.